at least one person on this Zoom, it's a good evening. And that is our speaker, our presenter, our teacher today. And I'm not going to do a whole huge introduction because this is our third session. Though some of you may be coming for the first time, and that works too, because these sessions are designed to stand alone. But I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of where we've come. First of all, our teacher is Rabbi Daniel Roth, who's the director of Mosaica, and that organization. We heard a little bit about in the first session the work that they do in third-party mediation, working with religious leaders in intense political conflicts, working with religious leaders to try and do back channel negotiation for peace. We learned a little bit about Rabbi Roth's work in that organization in the first session. And then the last session highlighted the fact that Rabbi Roth is also just a Torah teacher, and so we did some learning. We took a tour through Europe with the Chida, and that session is recorded and worth listening to as well, to get a sense of just of how our tradition has thought about mediation and negotiation, and how that's existed throughout Jewish history, and certain figures have been deeply involved in that kind of work. Today's session, we're zooming forward now into the present to think about the conflict that really had us reach out to Rabbi Roth in the first place, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is one obviously that our community has its eyes on, but it's also its heart on, and it's one that that continues to be right at the center of the Jewish conversation, the world conversation, in sometimes tragic and frustrating ways. And one of the reasons that we're excited to have, I'll say, the main reason that we're excited to have Rabbi Roth here is just that he's a voice we trust on this issue, and it's hard to find those voices, and the conversation always feels like it's dominated by political, dogma and extremism, and here we're getting a really different perspective and a real insider perspective, but also this particular approach, this particular lens, this particular method of working through the conflict is one that we just don't get to hear about in great detail often. So without further ado, this session will really focus on that, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there was an article that went around that I hope most of you have received. Maybe if you haven't, then just let us know. We can send that out. But I'm excited to do this, the third session, and really begin to get deep into the work of today, third of 4 sessions. And excited to be learning with you on this topic that I just feel so grateful to Rabbi Roth, because, like I'm also a Torah teacher, but when it comes to Israel-Palestine, I often feel just inept. Like I don't, I care about it. I've spent a lot of time there, but I don't know how to teach towards that topic. And that's why we're so grateful to have voices we trust doing so. So without further ado, Rabbi Daniel Roth.
Thank you, Rabbi Kasher. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So I'm going to share a screen. And those of you who were with me the first couple sessions, you already know a little bit of my style, that I'm going to want to present for about 30 minutes and then open it up for questions, conversation. So in this third session, as was just mentioned, just to give you a little bit of context, I'm going to frame it a little bit differently than how it just was. That the first session, I kind of started off with what's happened since May, which was in October. So I kind of was sharing some of the behind the scenes that I'm allowed to share of things that we've been involved with in back channel, insider mediation within the mixed cities, Jerusalem, the Middle East. The second session, I went really into more textual, historical. And now I'm going to go, in this session, I want to do a little bit more of the history of Religious Peace Initiative, going back to the 90s, and give you a deeper introduction into who some of the key who some of the key religious leaders are that have been leading this and one of the ramifications for today. So in a certain way, I'm going backwards. Like the first session was, I'm telling you what's happening now, and now I'm going to go a little bit behind the scenes, and then you're welcome to ask questions about, okay, how does that play out more today? And then our final session in February is going to be my attempt of sharing how you can try doing this within your own context, how you too can kind of play the role of an insider mediator and using some text and theory. So as it was sent out, the article that I shared was published in 2 different forms. I think you shared, did you share the PDF with them, which is more of an academic publication? Those of you who were at the first session, you can get this little booklet. I think there are still some in the office. And in addition to my article, there's a wonderful article by, I think, one of the greatest analysts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Ofer Zaltzberg, who goes through the 8 worldviews. People think of it as 2 narratives. He goes through the 8 narratives very briefly, and where the conflicts are, and the attempts, the failed attempts of international negotiators to try to mediate between them, and what can be done. And then there's a wonderful article by Rabbi Michal Malkior, who's the chair of our board at Mosaica, and his vision of what religious peace looks like, and then my article. The same material can also be found on a website in a non-academic version of the basically the same content on a website called Progress is Possible, which was an educational website put out by the S. Daniel Hebron Center for Middle East Peace, to try to explain to diplomats, academics, and just lay people a more complex understanding, exactly speaking to it, David, what you were just saying, like the challenge of how to actually teach this over, to be able to explain what the core issues are and what are the, as I said, the 8 different narratives about each of those issues. And then within this amazing educational website, there's also this section which focuses on religious peace building and the role of insider religious peace build, religious mediators, which also brings, videos of them speaking and pictures and things that you won't get in the regular PDF version. So that's just to share where this is at. So I'm assuming that not everyone had a chance to read this, and even if you had a chance to read it, I'm going to share it over a little bit in my own oral version, and then we'll open up for conversation. So this slide, I think I shared in my first session with you in LA, those of you who were there or watched the video. And this I have found to be really helpful framing in terms of the work that I'm engaged in, the work of the religious leaders that I work with, that often do things almost intuitively, but they don't conceptualize what it is that they're doing. And this notion of an insider mediator. I noticed that Ikar changed slightly my title from insider religious mediators to, I think, mediating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the inside, which is a slightly different meaning. It's not from the inside only, there's a concept that I want to try to get out there called insider mediation, which is, and I discussed this already, but an individual or group of individuals who derive their legitimacy, credibility, and influence from a socio-cultural and or religious and indeed personal closeness to the parties of the conflict, endowing them with the strong bonds of trust that help foster the necessary attitudinal changes amongst key protagonists, which over time prevent conflict and contribute to sustaining peace. And as I like to quote, to sum up in one sentence, one of the greatest insider religious mediators, Canon Andrew White, who's very unwell right now, but he was very involved in a lot of different religious peace initiatives as a mediator. He said in his very thick British accent, which I will not attempt to imitate, but he said, insider mediators is about, are you in touch with the bad guys? If you're not in touch with the bad guys, then you're not actually making peace. And that's a real challenge. Who are the people that are 99% aligned with the spoilers, quote unquote, of the conflict that could then have their trust to bring them into a different, non-violent, peaceful, sustainable peace process. And that's very different than the alleged kind of neutral outsider diplomat or mediator who's more of a professional outsider as opposed to an insider, trusted third party. And that goes back to some of the things that we talked about in the session last time, of how traditional Jewish peacemaking and traditional peacemaking in general to this day in the Sulha process and other cultural non-Western processes, the mediator is always the trusted insider. And part of the argument in my article here is that one of the missing ingredients, there are many missing ingredients for why we're stuck in the conflict, but one of them is not the lack of great solutions to the conflict, but it's the people that are actually the messengers that are going back and forth between the communities that especially feel most isolated around the conflict. So looking at the case studies of Northern Ireland, or I mentioned of Nigeria, where you had two heads of militias, a Christian and a Muslim militia, who found each other, and then they become insider mediators. They're still connected to their militias, they still have their communities, but now they're the ones who are mediating, not the UN, not the EU, and not an NGO that's coming for a few years and then leaving, but they're there. And they have, you know, they suffered losses personally. I mentioned, I think that that Mosaic, we have a parallel program in Europe where a rabbi and an imam work together as the mediators, where we're piloted in Malmö, Sweden, one of the centers of anti-Semitism in Europe, working to fight simultaneously Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in an amazing, amazing way. We're in the process of opening that up in 15 other cities throughout Europe. So when I say insider mediators, insider religious mediators, okay, advancing religious peace, what do I mean by religious peace? So first of all, I want to define religious peace as a warm peace, not just as a cold, or what can often refer to as sort of a cold political peace, like Israel-Egypt is a cold peace right now. It is often contrasted with secular political peace. Political peace may be understood as consisting of a peace agreement negotiated and signed by primarily secular politicians, often with a liberal worldview and based on tangible interests. In contrast, religious peace is achieved on a foundation of shared core religious values and beliefs. It's like a different language when you have religious leaders being able to engage in the sanctity of land, sanctity of human life. Religious language is very different than the regular political language of international diplomacy. And it's a part that's been missing. As I'm going to argue, it's not that religious peace should replace political peace. Far be it. We're not trying to get rid of the politicians. Okay, it's not an an anarchistic approach of being anti-political, as some religious initiatives are, or against secular peace. It's about how to expand the tent of peace to include those that have often felt most excluded. And the necessity for advancing religious peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict stems from the understanding the conflict is not only a dispute between national identities over scarce resources that can be divided up fairly through interest-based problem solving, but as a collusion of worldviews. These are, when you have issues of how Jews are interpreting non-Jews, meaning the status of what a non-Jew or a Muslim is, or Islam is, or you have Islamic scholars, how they are describing what Jews are in their religious language. These are core issues of the conflict that politicians have absolutely no skill or access to be able to engage in that part of the barrier to us of being able to reach sustainable, warm peace between people. So it's the collusion of worldviews that poses a huge challenge. That the argument is that you have to engage those that are actually having sort of a significant influence on crafting those worldviews that are part of the conflict. And here, my argument is religious leaders, only religious leaders serving as insider religious mediators who have a deep understanding of the religious worldviews in question and possess strong ties to the most influential, and here I'll add in parentheses, often extreme, representatives of these views are able to manifest a peace that includes these religious worldviews, as opposed to secular peace that is predicated on their exclusion, meaning the feeling that people had from Oslo. And I remember I was graduating high school, was hurry up and let's sign the Oslo Accords before the religious Zionists get too strong and before Hamas gets too strong. And let's make peace between the secular, rational Fatah and the secular, rational Israeli left. And the argument is that didn't really work, and recycling that concept will still not work, and is in fact, if in 1993 Hamas was only 6 years old at the time, founded in 87, okay, now Hamas has significant influence and power. The religious right wing has growing significance, influence, and power. So again, to quote Canon Andrew White, somebody's got to be in touch with these power base of worldviews that are directly colliding one with another, and that in many ways have surpassed the secular Fatah on the Palestinian side influence and the secular Israeli left wing. Someone needs to be engaging them, and the best people suited to engage them are people from within those groups that can have one religious speaking to another religious leader and saying, let's try to interpret things differently. So I don't want to just talk theory. I want to talk, I want to share with you how this works. I think this one I also shared with you, but I'm doing this as a bit of review. When you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people think, okay, well, who are the sides that represent the conflict? So you have our sort of prime ministers, okay? I guess they are, they have to go together right now, Bennett and Lapid. Abu Mazen is the head of the negotiation on the other side. Well, but what about these two? Sinwar, Hania, Khalid Mashal, meaning the very influential leaders of Hamas. They control Gaza, okay? Not only do they have influence on the street, but they control of the West Bank, but they also have significant influence, obviously, in Gaza and beyond. What about these leaders that are sitting in East Jerusalem? Sheikh Akram Sabari, Sheikh
Rabbi Roth.
Dana. Oh, are you not seeing this?
Yeah, as you're listing people, I'm starting to realize that that means you're probably switching slides. But the way that that screen share works is that you share the screen and then you can't change it. You have to share it. So now we're seeing.
You see that now?
Yep.
So you have these very influential Palestinian religious leaders that are in East Jerusalem, that what they say has often very significant influence on what's going on in the conflict. Okay, so who's engaging them? Can you see these these two that I just included? Sheikh Kardawi, we're going to talk about him in a moment. I think I mentioned him in my first session, but he is the top religious leader of the Muslim Brotherhood who sits in Qatar. Okay, he is the religious leader of the Hamas and beyond, and of hundreds of millions of people. If he rules that Jews living in Israel are kafir, are heretics, that you can't have any peace with them, by definition, they're not part of people of the book. That has very significant influence over the ability of the Palestinians to ever be able to have any kind of sustainable peace with this state. If he rules that suicide bombings is a positive thing, that has significant influence over Hamas's ability to do that. So who's in touch with him? And his replacement, he's 96, Sheikh El Raisuni, who's Moroccan. You can see the one on the left, who has shifted some of the views. Sheikh El Isa, who everyone might recall as the Saudi Islamic leader who came to Auschwitz right before COVID, who's been very, very influential in advancing religious peace. So you have all these different 2 or 3 very influential religious Islamic leaders that have influence well beyond their own countries. And they influence what's going on the streets of the West Bank, of Gaza, and of Lod, and Jerusalem. And on the Israeli side, you have the police, you have the Shin Bet, and then you have these rabbis that nobody ever necessarily knows who they are, but they have a lot of influence. They're not the ones who often are the chief rabbi, right, who have official influence, official authority. They're the ones who don't have official positions, but have a lot of influence over what's actually happening. So who's negotiating between all these people? You know, the US, the EU, the Qataris, the Egyptians. These are the countries that have been trying to mediate between the sides. The argument in my article is actually there have been other people behind the scenes who have been secretly mediating between all these different parties and creating a web of trust to be able to solve practical problems in real time that then can strengthen the web of trust to ultimately pull the whole conflict towards a more positive direction. So who are these people? Okay. And I chose 8. I'm going to just focus in our session right now on one. He's the one who, David, I don't know if I said this in my first session, but you can check me on it. We're now 2022. I want by the end of this decade that there is a major motion picture. Okay, I'm talking to people from LA. Somebody's got to know somebody from the Hollywood business here. I want a major motion picture about Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish. First, there's got to be a best-selling book. And then everybody has to know his story like people know MLK and they know Gandhi. Because if the entire world knows about his story, I think we're going to be closer to religious peace and to real peace. Why? Because I think in his story is sort of the roadmap of what happened. So I want to just spend a few minutes sharing his story, because the article that I wrote doesn't do full justice to it. It's just kind of a little piece to it. Sheikh Abdullah was born in the middle of the War of Independence, or the Nakba, okay? He was born actually almost entirely paralyzed. His entire body, his parents almost gave up on him in this middle of the war. Iraqi doctors actually saved his life because Kafr Khasib, which you can see is right on the green line, it's within the state of Israel. Okay, it's within the 1948 borders, but during the war, it switched hands many times between the Iraqis and the Jews. His life is ultimately saved by this doctor, but he has no. But he remains paralyzed, I think, in his left or right arm for the rest of his life. But that was the first miracle. It's like we just read stories of Moses as miracles that happened to him when he was a baby. That's the way Muslims tell over his story. 1956, one of the greatest stains on the state of Israel, the massacre of Kafr Khasib, where it was on the eve of the Sinai, the war with the Egyptians in 1956, and the Israeli Arabs at the time were not citizens. They were under military control, and a curfew was declared, and then the curfew was made up earlier, an hour earlier. It was moved from like 6 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and all the farmers were still out in their fields. And the orders that were given to the Israeli soldiers were to shoot to kill. And sure enough, in Kfar Qasim, 49 men, women, and children were lined up and shot and killed. It's one of the greatest stains on the state of Israel. 5 of the cities, the officers disobeyed orders, but in that particular area in Kafr Qasim, they obeyed the order, and it has now become a law in Israel of the importance, the law of disobeying, the necessity to disobey a total immoral law a total immoral command that was given to you. Every Israeli officer, police, and army have to go and learn about the story of Kafr Khasib, of when to disobey an order. But Sheikh Abdullah was 9 years old when he witnessed direct members of his family killed in front of him. So you can imagine that as a youngster, his feeling towards Jews, towards Israel, were extremely, extremely negative. I should note he actually grew up in a communist home, like many Israeli Arabs or Palestinians of 48, as they refer to themselves. He grew up secular communist. There were very, very few religious in his time period. All of that changes in the 1967 war, because in 1967, the Palestinians of the interior, meaning Israeli Arabs, all of a sudden become reunited with the Palestinians of the West Bank of 67. And he becomes the first Israeli Arab who has now Israeli citizenship, because they got citizenship a couple years beforehand in the 60s, to go to Nablus, to Shem, and to learn in the Institute of Islamic Studies. They didn't want to let him in. And it's a whole story that's counted as the second miracle of his life, that it was a miracle that he becomes the person who goes and studies there. And while he's there, he learns about the Muslim Brotherhood. He learns about Hassan al-Banna, who was assassinated in 1948, who was the founder of the Brotherhood. I'm not going to explain the whole concept of the Muslim Brotherhood, but as I already noted, it is by far the most influential of the Islamic movements in the world. It is a debate within Europe and America. Should it be deemed as a terrorist organization or not? Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Erdogan has a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Each country has, throughout the entire Muslim world, has branches of the Muslim Brotherhood that are all now independent. They all do as they see fit according to their religious rulers in that city, in that area. But at the time, they were all very, very much connected. And it's about political Islam, creating a caliphate, an Islamic state. And Sheikh Abdullah becomes in love with this idea. He becomes religious. 1971, he goes back to Kafr Khasib and he founds the Islamic movement, okay? Which first is basically just a social, educational. He gets people out of the pubs. He gets people into the mosques. He starts preaching. He starts, getting people to become more religious. He describes the first head covering. No one ever covered their hair. So he went to a tailor and he showed him how I want you to actually, he drew out on a piece of paper, like, how do you make a hijab? Because they didn't know what to do. Then in 1978, he founds the Islamic Jihad, the Usrat al-Jihad, the first Islamic terror organization. This is about 10 years before Hamas is founded, okay? He's inspired by the Iranian Revolution, that he thinks like this idea of creating an Islamic caliphate state has real potential. Then he gets imprisoned, 1981. Together with 70 other people part of this terrorist organization. As I know from my friends, there was actually 400 people, but Israel never found them. And while he's in prison, he sits and he studies Islam. And he goes through this deep introspection moment. He's meeting with Jews. He's meeting with different people. They're all stuck in the cells together. And he comes and the way he describes it is that he went into the depths of Islam and he realized that the direction that he was in was wrong. The whole scene of what happens while he is in a jail, like, that's got to be a major part of this film, okay? He comes out 1984, he's released, and as part of a swap of hostage exchange, and he comes out and everybody goes out and greets him and said, we're going to continue with the jihad. And he says, I am Sheikh Abdullah. I am your leader. And I am now the first soldier for peace. For now on, I only believe in nonviolence. Everybody said, and by the way, he said, I am the founder of the Islamic movement in the state of Israel. And everyone says, yeah. And he says, you didn't listen. I said the state of Israel. He said, there is a thing, it's called the State of Israel, and we're going to recognize it. Not only that, we're going to do this crazy idea, we're going to run for elections in our cities. And everyone said, but if you run for elections, then you're normalizing, you're accepting the existence of the Jewish Zionist state. And he said, no, this is what Islam teaches, and he proves to them, and however he can, they run for municipal elections, and they gain tremendous support over Hadash. Okay, if people think that the tension between the Islamic movement and Hadash, the Communist Party, started when the Joint List broke up about a year and a half ago, no, it goes back. Okay, 1993, there's still one Islamic movement, and he supports the Oslo Accords, as do others that are with him. So he's, on the one hand, entirely religiously like Hamas. They come from the same Beit Midrash. They come from the same house of thought, house of study. On the other hand, politically, he's in favor of the peace process. Is very close with Yasser Arafat, and that's going to turn him into being a mediator between Hamas and Fatah. 1996, he said, we haven't gone far enough. Now it's time to run for the Knesset. Now, everyone who thought he was just thinking tactically, okay, running for elections at Kfar Qasem, that's one thing. Running to have a political party in the Knesset when you're part of the Islamic movement, you've lost your mind. And that's when you have the split between the northern branch and the southern branch, which again, I think no one ever heard of until a couple years ago, when no one knew what Ram was. It was just another little party part of the Joint List. But Sheikh Abdullah splits with the other co-founder, Sheikh Raed Salah, who is to this day, he just came out of jail a few weeks ago. He is to this day part of the northern branch. The differences between the southern branch and the northern branch, to what extent are they deep and essential, or are they just tactical, is the debate in my mind of to what extent there will be sustainable peace or not. And I am happy to explain further, okay? But the same debates that are happening within the two Islamic movements in Israel, okay? The northern branch was deemed a terrorist organization by the State of Israel in 2015, while the southern branch is sitting in coalition with Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid right now. So that difference of worldview is a difference that's happening within the heads of the Muslim Brotherhood in Qatar and throughout the entire Middle East of how do they interpret what's going on with their Islamic sources to now. And we'll come back and happy to answer questions. 2005, after 96, he retired from head of the Islamic movement. 2005, he co-founds the Religious Peace Initiative, okay, with Rabbi Michael Malkior, who was at the time a member of the Knesset. He passes away in 2017. And just who eulogized him, in my mind, should be like the beginning scene, okay? Here you have, in Kfar Qasem, the founder of the Islamic Jihad movement being eulogized by Khaled Mashal and Ismail Haniya, the number 1 and 2 of Hamas, who call up from Gaza and are calling and eulogizing him, saying, you were 20 years ahead of us when you talked about Islamic Jihad, and you were 20 years ahead of us when you talked about religious peace. You're constantly, we respect you, but we disagree with you. We're not where you are at yet. And at the same time, you had Rabbi Malkior eulogize him. You had Rabbi Avi Gisser eulogize him, one of the heads of the settlement movement, religious Zionist, right-wing rabbi, who had been friends with Sheikh Abdullah for 20 years, having secret meetings and negotiations, who was one of the rabbis behind Bennett, okay? So you have, that part probably should be censored out. You have all these people who all felt close to him, and this kind of inner contradiction of his identity is what allows him to be, what allowed him to be an insider mediator. It's almost that if you want to be an insider mediator, you have to be full of sort of an inner contradiction of different opinions and values that are in conflict with one another. For him, they were in harmony, but from everybody outside, it just didn't make any sense how you could be with this one and that one at the same time. So this, oh, this is the picture. If we can just pause it for one moment, the recording. Andrea, the recording. So you see already in the 90s, in a very informal, ad hoc way, they're trying to figure out ways to advance religious peace. He writing letters, working with rabbis. The major breakthrough happens in the middle of the Second Intifada, 2002, with the Alexandria Declaration. It was the only moment during the Second Intifada that Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat were in agreement that they were going to send their religious leaders to go and meet with each other in Alexandria with the leaders of Al-Azhar, the biggest Islamic institution in Egypt, Rabbi Bakshi Doron, the chief rabbi, and they sign this declaration. If you want to read more about it, you can look at online, go into Yechezkel Landau, Religious Peace Building, from the United States Institute for Peace. He wrote it up, and you can read the declaration, who was in it. It's called for religious peace. But I don't want to spend more time on that. But what was missing from that amazing historical moment were still what can be referred to as the spoilers, meaning nobody was representing the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas, and no one was representing the right-wing religious Zionist settler movement. Yes, it's very impressive to have Rabbi Bakshi Doron, the chief rabbi of Israel, and really impressive to have Sheikh Al-Azhar. But you don't have Sheikh Kardawi, and you don't have the rabbis who are influential over the right-wing religious Zionist group. That becomes the work that Sheikh Abdullah goes out and Rabbi Malkiel as his partner to say, let's not work with the people that agree with us. Let's go out and find those that totally disagree with us and engage them in religious peace. And they go on this journey, literally, of traveling, of meeting, of debating with the biggest anti-Semites, the biggest racists, arc terrorists, but have major influence to convince them that the same way there is a religious calling to have jihad or have holy war, there's also a religious calling to have holy peace. There's a nice little video that's in Hebrew that I translated part of it in the article of his speech that he gave just a couple years before he died, where he tells sort of in a synopsis his story of how he was the founder of the Islamic Jihad movement, and then how he went to jail and came out, and then how he declared the need to work for religious peace. Now, what's important is Sheikh Abdullah was not just a strange bird who is sort of like interesting but has no influence, because you see right now to this day, okay, you see that the influence is continuing. That Mansour Abbas is a direct student of Sheikh Abdullah, and that the people all the way in Qatar are still struggling with to what extent should they incorporate his way of thinking of Islam as opposed to earlier interpretations, which were more violently oriented. So just to give a very just a couple of points before I pause, because I've gone longer than I wanted to. What does that mean? What do they actually do as insider mediators? So, as I note in my article, most of it is secret meetings. Okay, most of it are not in front of the cameras. It's just tens, hundreds of meetings. Sometimes you could wait a year until we get a meeting with the right person in the right way, with the right trusted parties. It's not dialogue groups. It's not facilitated. It's not, 10 rabbis and 10 sheikhs with a wonderful professional facilitator meeting 10 times, and then you can see how they felt before and how they felt after. It's really messy work that's connected to the reality of what's going on. Here on the left is a picture of, there's a question that often comes up about the role of women. You have Hadassah Froman and Rabbanit Dina Barshal, daughter of Ravadia, who also served as, to a certain degree, as insider mediators with Sheikh Abdullah and Rabbi Froman. On the right, this was the most public gathering where you had a couple of the top leaders who are connected to Hamas, but they're the left wing of Hamas. I know that might sound strange, meaning they're part of Hamas, but they are in line with Sheikh Abdullah, but they're still part of Hamas. Meeting with right-wing religious Zionists, meaning not the Rabbi Malki or left-wing religious Zionists, but the right wing, and coming up with declarations, etc. I talked, I think, when I was with you in LA about the work of mixed cities that Mosaic had been involved with for 20 years. Now we're even more involved in it. But putting out, Sheikh Abdullah, you see him next to Rabbi Malkior. The person on our left, Sheikh Abdullah's right, that's Sheikh Abbas Zakur. He's my partner in ACO. As you might remember, in May, there were tremendous tension in the mixed cities. Sheikh Abbas Zakur is the one who literally, he simply drove to the nearest Hesder yeshiva, religious Zionist yeshiva, walked right into the yeshiva and said, "Show me your Rosh Yeshiva, show him to me, have him come with me. I want him to hold my hand. We're going to walk the streets together and tell all the kids that are throwing and shooting at each other to go home." Like, he's a fearless follower of Sheikh Abdullah, very, very influential. And he is an insider mediator in Akka working with us, connecting between the religious Zionist and the Islamic movement. On the right, you see a fatwa that was written, they say for the first time since Maimonides, that they brought Islamic leaders to talk about the importance of respecting Yom Kippur. This was in 2014 when Yom Kippur and Eid al-Adha overlapped with one another. And then we trained in 2019 the 300 top Israeli police officers for a full day about what to do if there would ever be a blow up in Jerusalem and the mixed cities, how to engage insider religious mediators. And unfortunately, I think some of them might have been playing with their phones. They didn't, whatever. The police didn't function well enough in May. I think they realized that. We work very closely with the police. We do tremendous amount of work in cultural sensitivity, working with them around the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa. I want to talk about suicide bombings, okay? Sheikh Qaradawi, see him on the left? Sheikh Qaradawi was the one who gave the fatwa, the religious ruling, praising suicide bombings, which gave the green light for Hamas to go ahead and do that in the 90s. Sheikh Abdullah in 1999 did something almost insane. He wrote a fatwa against Sheikh Qaradawi, saying suicide bombings are against Islam. No one does that. You don't do that, because Sheikh Qaradawi is in a totally different league than Sheikh Abdullah in terms of his knowledge. Sheikh Abdullah learned for a year or 2 years in Nablus. He's not the greatest scholar in the Muslim world, but he argued that is wrong. To this day, the fact that he wrote that book is extremely controversial. But in 2016, Dr. Nasser al-Din Anshar, who I write about in my article, who was flirted as maybe a potential candidate to replace Abu Mazen one day in the Palestinian press, because he is accepted both by the Fatah and by Hamas and by the people, because he's not considered corrupt. He's done a lot about the status of women, about freedom of press. He is a religious leader, a politician, and was very aligned with Sheikh Abdullah. He lives in Nablus. Okay, he's a professor also at El Najah. He was close with Sheikh Qaradawi, and he went and, in a conversation with Sheikh Qaradawi, had Sheikh Qaradawi revert that fatwa and say that suicide bombings are illegal. Here is, these religious leaders will also often show up after terrorist attacks, denouncing them. This was after the tragic terrorist attack of radical Jews burning the Dawabsha family. And you see Sheikh Abdullah meeting with Rabbi Stern, one of the most influential, the Rabbi of Jerusalem, very, very influential rabbi, Rabbi Stav. See this person over here? He just was elected last night as the boss of Mansour Abbas. I'm assuming everyone knows who Mansour Abbas is. Everyone knows who Mansour Abbas is? Mansour Abbas is the political wing of the southern branch of the Islamic movement. He was elected, but Sheikh Safwat Fridge, the person in the white, was just elected in a nail-biting, we were following the elections. No one on the planet knows that this election just happened, okay? But it was the biggest thing that the Muslim world is following because he's totally aligned with religious peace. He's been connected to Mosaica for 15 years, very, very aligned with Mansour Abbas's role, has been meeting with religious Zionist rabbis. He just became the head of the Islamic movement last night. So he is sort of, he's behind Mansour Abbas, meaning he's like the head religious leader behind it. Denouncing anti-Semitism has been a really important part. The fact that Sheikh Abdullah in 2007 met and talked with 300 American Jews and Israelis, heads of communities, talking about the importance of teaching about the Holocaust and denouncing anti-Semitism. In 2007, there were no Islamic leaders doing that. When Mansour Abbas became famous, it was on Holocaust Remembrance Day when he talked about that it's an Islamic commandment to commemorate the Holocaust. Okay. We talked about the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, the role they played, and the importance of mediating between Fatah and Hamas. And finally, again, final word is that I'm arguing that there is a missing piece of the peace process, which is who's mediating it. That if there are people from the inside that are connected to, as I referred to, the bad guys, whoever those bad guys might be, but generally they're shooting at each other. Okay, and I'm not saying that Sahel, that the IDF is bad or this. I'm saying how they are perceived. It is a deeply intractable identity conflict that secular diplomats using international relations, diplomacy alone cannot solve this because they don't have the trust or the language to be able to argue within the religious rulings of those that are part of the spoilers of any peace process. I am not arguing that what I'm saying is possible. I am arguing that if we don't succeed in engaging these leaders that have so much influence over what's happening, the chances of a serious, sustainable peace between people is minimal. So I'm going to pause here. I went over my time and open up for questions.
I think I'll ask one just to get the ball rolling here, and then I'll call on folks in the group. So just indicate with a hand raise, and I'll call on you. I just want to ask. This is in some ways, I bet, kind of an annoying question because it's one that I think comes up a lot and doesn't get directly at the kinds of negotiations that you've been describing. But I just when you describe the founder of the Islamic Jihad, I guess I want to hear, like, you know, in the conversation you're having, how the word jihad lands. Like, I think we who know so little about Arabic to begin with and Islam to begin with, you know, it's the commonplace thing to say, oh, if you use the word jihad, like, you just want to kill us all. And is that what is being indicated there? And like, what does it mean to start a party called the Islamic Jihad? Was that I know he retracted a little bit from where he had been, but was that where he had been a kill all the Jews position? I guess I've always wondered whether, because I do also sometimes hear, I don't know, are they apologists saying, no, jihad can be a peaceful thing, and jihad, you know, like, so I just wonder, language like that, which feels so alarming to me on the other side, like how it lands in that conversation.
Like, jihad, the meaning of jihad in Islam have a lot of different meanings. It can mean, like, in a strange way, it's almost like hishtadlus, like people, like in the Muslim, like people just making an effort to be holy and you know, a jihad of making the world a better place. I mean, it can mean in a lot of different contexts, okay? But in the political Islamic context of the Muslim Brotherhood, it definitely meant establishing, using force to come and create caliphate states. It was against the the Muslim Brotherhood was a reaction against colonialism, British colonialism, and then a reaction against the corrupt secular puppet states that were created in the Middle East from their perspective. And the Zionist kind of regime from their perspective was just another one of these colonialist states that were set up by, you know, that needed to kind of have, yeah, a holy war to supplant them. You know, what's interesting to me now is, okay, Sheikh Abdullah went in a different direction, and he led a whole group of people into a different direction. He never said there isn't jihad in Islam, and I mean militant jihad, because that would be ignoring the options of interpretation. He's not saying let's be apologetic and say this doesn't exist. This exists. This option is on the table. But the extent that that's on the table, there's also the option of the same kind of fervor and being brave of making peace. Like, he would argue many times, I'm not making peace because I'm weak. I'm making peace because I'm strong. And I'm strong in my faith in God that I need to make peace, and we need to be nonviolent. So what's interesting is, well, what about the Northern Branch that is now deemed as a terrorist organization that stays with the original concept of Sheikh Abdullah, and that totally thinks that he lost his mind? You know, how are they interpreting the state? How are they interpreting jihad? How are they interpreting Jews? There's a tremendous amount of that needs to be unpacked about these terms and how they're being interpreted and educated within the different communities. But we are not talking about strictly jihad of waking up and praying early in the morning. We're talking about, in this particular context, when he was making an effort in order to sanctify God's name and creating a caliphate state.
Janet, and I think I have to, because we've upped our security, I have to like ask you to unmute. So I'll call on you and then just look for yeah, that works. There.
Thank you. Rabbi Roth, it's so great to learn with you. And while you were speaking about the Muslim influence in the peacemaking process, it occurred to me there are a lot of Christian Arab citizens of Israel, and they're not mentioned. They live in Nazareth, they live in Bethlehem, and I was wondering if you have incorporated them into the Mosaic work that you're doing. And my second really quick question is, what was the name of the person who was elected last night? So, because I'm really interested in that. Thank you.
So his name is Sheikh Safwat Fridge.
Okay.
Okay, he's from Kfar Khasib. Mansour Abbas and Sheikh Safwat were both the deputy heads of the Islamic movement. So Mansour Abbas moved into becoming the head of, he was elected political head of Ram, and Sheikh Safwat just moved into being, so it's incredible that, to my mind, it's a real vote of confidence in the coalition and in this public support of what Mansour is doing, which is not clear at all, that he's being attacked by the right wing in Israel significantly as a terrorist. His life is being threatened every day. He can't take Israeli security to protect him, because that would be an oxymoron. And at the same time, the entire Middle East is outraged with him because they think he's lost his mind. It's the religious leaders, which again, I didn't talk enough about, but it's not just Sheikh Safwat, it's Sheikh Raed Badir, who I talk about in my article, who was Sheikh Abdullah's main protege, who he sent to learn with the top Islamic leaders around the Middle East, who's our key partner, who is the one who makes sure in a certain way that nobody attacks Mansour around the Middle East, because he'll say, I'll challenge you to a what do you call it? A dukrav.
A duel?
A duel, thank you. A duel of Islamic law. And I'll prove to you that what Mansour is doing in meeting with rabbis and sitting with a right-wing prime minister who doesn't even recognize a two-state solution is still the right thing. Like, it's a crazy. Your question about Christians is a great question. If you noticed, in the two conferences that I showed pictures from, right, in 2002 and 2016, there were the top Christian leaders. There was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and there was there were other major Christian leaders in these conferences. We have I think I told you when I was in LA that we have a relationship with the WHO, and working with senior religious leaders. We have a great little documentary coming out about our work, where I worked very closely with the Archbishop here. So I work closely with the Christian community, but when it comes to the real difficult work in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Christians are not the spoilers as much. So we really are focused on those that are shooting, and fortunately, Christians here are not the ones who are, running the terror organizations. Maybe that was different in the 70s, but the religious leaders of the Christians are already sort of more in a more open to anything nonviolent and peaceful, and we only try to work with those that are difficult.
Thank you.
Rachel Wallace.
Sorry, it took me a minute. I'm Rachel Wallace from Los Angeles, born and raised. I'm actually in Israel now, studying my master's at IDC. And as we speak, I'm getting kicked out of the library. But I'm curious to know, first of all, this was a very enlightening discussion. And I'm curious in the long term how, more of the secular politicians, political group trying to achieve peace can reconcile, its future goals with some of these religious leaders, and what is their stance on a two-state solution at the end of the day, and how do they see each group, Jews, Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, living on this land? What is their ultimate long-term goal there?
So it's two separate questions. The first is that, as I noted, this type of mediation is not replacing, it's supporting. It's that the argument is in that so long as that there is not, I'll say it in the positive. There is a religious ruling being written right now. It's halfway done, I've seen it. That is going to be a couple hundred pages, a fatwa that will establish the religious foundation for religious peace. And if that fatwa that's being written by a top religious leader gets the approval of the heads of the Muslim Brotherhood, the people in Al-Azhar in Egypt, and the people in Saudi Arabia, meaning the three major sources of religious leadership in the Muslim world, that would then allow for political negotiations to have the religious license in a way that it's never happened before, to be able to then start negotiating. I'm hoping that religious ruling will be done in the next few months. Okay, how long will it take to then get those religious approvals? I hope within the year. Let's see what happens in a year from now. It would be a historic moment if that happens. Now that religious ruling, and again, it's not to the exclusion of secular institutions or secular peace. We work all the time with everybody. The solutions, and I talk about this in my article. So all of the Islamic leaders that are connected to Sheikh Abdullah and his direction were fervent two-state solution in their outlook. Sheikh Abdullah, was considered to have gone crazy when he said from this, because he lived right on the border, right? He said, over here, this is what's called the state of Israel. Over here, that's what's going to be Palestine. And part of that identity of the southern branch of the Islamic movement is that they want to be integrated into Israeli society. And the only way they can really do that long term is if there is a proper two-state solution. And they are therefore sort of a mediator because they're politically aligned more with Fatah, religiously a little bit more aligned with Hamas, although they're more liberal on many issues. And that's important for them, that there be a political solution, but that's not just political, that's religiously sanctioned. Okay, they believed that Oslo was good, but wasn't going to work because it didn't have the religious backing. The rabbis, okay, with the exception of Rabbi Malkior, who has been involved in this for, in the two-state solution for decades. I mentioned Rabbi Abi Gisser, okay, who eulogized Sheikh Abdullah. He's a strong advocate, has been a strong advocate against the two-state solution. But years meeting with Sheikh Abdullah and then Sheikh Raid, he has then become very aware of what the problems are and the real need to find creative solutions, whether they be in a different form of a two-state solution in his mind or a one-state solution. But I think what's interesting is, so there is I'm not denying that there is a disconnect between where the religious Zionist rabbis are that are very wary of a two-state solution and where the people from Sheikh Abdullah's camp are, which again, are the only ones in the Muslim Brotherhood Islamic movement in the world that are saying yes to peace and recognition of a Jewish state in the land of Israel or in Palestine. Okay, I mean, Hamas, the northern branch, the whole Muslim Brotherhood world, everyone thinks that that's crazy. So from an Israeli perspective, they haven't gone far enough. From the Muslim world perspective, they've gone very, very far. But when they talk about a two-state solution, it's very different than I think the way many Israelis are terrified of a two-state solution, because their assumption is that this two-state solution will be grounded in peace between peoples. And therefore, you're going to have more of an open border concept in their thinking, meaning that there would be real trust instead of deep animosity. And their argument is that if Israel has peace with the Muslim world, not just because of F-16s and Jareds and great deals, etc., with the Emirates, which is not religious peace. The Abrahamic Accords is against religious peace because they bought religious leaders and forced them to sign on peace agreements. Okay, but if there's real religious peace, where the Muslim world is willing to accept the state of Israel, the nature of those two states would be different than I think the way people think of the two-state solution, even in terms of figuring out what's going to happen with settlers, with the refugee situation, with borders, with holy sites. So they call it two-state solutions. They're not replacing the generals and the politicians, but they do leave for a lot of area in terms of what this would actually look like when it comes down to the nitty-gritty details.
I saw Paul Hackner.
Hello, my name's Paul. I really appreciate your description of the desire for a warm peace. I think that is, obviously a solution that we're looking towards. I've spent a lot of time in secular online, interactions with the Palestinians and Israelis and in chats. And my question to you from a religious perspective is, what people like you and Mosaic, how they react to this kind of new identitarian, indigenous movement that that some of the American religious leaders are promoting, which essentially is kind of Kahanist one state solution ideology and wrapped in this strange kind of identity politics. I've heard I've heard religious rabbis, Chabad rabbis, on the apps discuss this and promote this. And while indigeneity is a great conversation, and I'm very interested in it, they sort of hijack it and in lieu of promoting some sort of Jewish pride, they're trying to promote a concept I don't know how to explain it that well, but if you have any reaction to some of the stuff I said, I'd be interested.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which group you're referring to, because you mentioned Chabad, and Chabad in general is not involved in the political conversation, but there's a certain subsect or has their roots in Chabad in particular Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who, again, you mentioned also America, you mentioned Chabad. The only person I know that fits the profile who you're referring to is Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who is by far the most radical religious leader in the West Bank, who's sort of the rabbi of the Hilltop Youth, if you will. And he doesn't even come from the school of thought of Rabbi Kook, that, you know, people used to think Rav Kook was the radical, because he believed in this messianic, you know, redemption through the state. Well, the Chabad, it's not classic Chabad. Let's not confuse this with Chabad, but it's this comes from this deeply mystical, Kabbalistic Chabad notion of creating a kingdom of Judea that is like literally fighting against the state of Israel as a democracy. That is some pretty radical, messed up stuff. And, you know, we saw examples of things happen over the weekend, of vigilante, you know, attacks against left-wing Israelis working with Palestinians with planting trees. So you have a tension within the settler movement, that you have the mainstream settler movement that are adherent to the teachings of Rav Kook, that believe in the institution of the state of Israel and abiding by the laws of the state of Israel, whatever they might be. And then you have this kind of fringe group that's coming from a very different school of thought that is, you know, literally fighting against IDF soldiers every single day. There's a little intifada of the settlers against Israeli soldiers. So, you know, how much influence do they have to mess things up is a big question. I will note that we are in, and I think I said this in the first session when we met, we are in a historic crossroads right now. People might think that we're stuck. We're not stuck. We are literally in a moment where we're heading towards unprecedented potential for peace, or we are headed for unprecedented potential for chaos. And I think we saw it when you look at the events of May, where you had Hamas and, I'll argue, northern branch, okay, parts of the Islamic movement that really wanted to rile things up in the mixed cities in Jerusalem and other places. And then you have Itamar Ben-Gvir and the Kahanis that really, really want to mess up Bennett's move. So you have the religious Zionists, which are always considered the extreme, split right now. And you have the Islamic movement split right now. And the split between them is growing deeper and deeper, as Mansour and now Sheikh Safwat are growing further and further, closer and closer to wanting to work with being a bridge between the state of Israel and the Middle East. So, and you have a lot of people that are, what happened in the Negev last week, where you had tremendous tension. There are people on both sides, from the right and on the Arab side, on the extremes, that want to break any potential for cooperation. And then you have people that are the moderate extremes working together. So the same thing that's happening with these fringe groups in the West Bank. There are lots of people that want to blow things up because they're looking for Armageddons. And then there are people that say, keep Armageddons in the books. Let's try to create pragmatic peace.
Okay, Frederick Schultz.
Myself. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Hi, Rabbi, and hi, everybody. Okay, thank you so much. I had loved your talk. It was very encouraging, actually. I guess my main fear is, you know, on both sides, it sounds like my fear is if some religious leader says, let's make peace, most people on, I don't know what percentage, but I'm feeling maybe most people on both sides are going to say, okay, I don't care what you say. I don't want peace, whether it's the Hamas or the PLO, I guess that their symbol is all of Israel, and or the quote facts on the ground that Israel is establishing, where it's the opposite. So I don't know. I mean, my fear is just if some religious leader says we want peace, everybody will say, yeah, well, we want our homes back, or we want all of Israel, or whatever. So, okay, that's, and I do like to have hope, but I just want your take on. Okay, thank you.
I think that the question is not some religious leader. It's a question of who has influence over the conflict that's going on right now. You know, and as I drew out that kind of map of the pictures, Abu Mazen has the most influence over the Palestinians? Clearly not. Who has influence? So probably the greatest influence over everybody is this thing, is the 16, 17-year-olds and what they're seeing on TikTok. You know, I'll be very honest. I mean, you know, when I think about, I'll say two things. First of all, if anybody has influence, as whether it be positive or negative influence, I think some of these religious leaders actually do have a significant amount of influence. Okay, not over those guys that beat up, you know, the peace activists over the weekend. Maybe Rabbi Ginberg has been influenced. People were telling me the other day how people try to talk to him and tell them to call his boys off. I don't know if he could, if he even wanted to at this point. Okay, but that's not the majority of where people are at. Okay, but when you're looking at families, at communities, you know, the Islamic movement has, it's not just one leader. The way they've created it, and this is the way the Muslim Brotherhood works for better and for worse. And by the way, same thing with religious Zionists, with the Garganim Toranim, with these communities, is that they do social justice work. They get people off drugs, they get people off the streets, they build schools, they build hospitals, they're very well educated, so they solve everyday problems. And when you solve everyday problems, then you're relevant to people's lives, including the youth. I'll just share with you one story of something that I'm doing right now, which is that we have a catastrophe, we have a plague in this country of 126 Palestinians of 48, meaning Israeli Arabs, that were killed in crime and violence and mob violence. Okay, 800 attempted murders over 2021. I run, you know, we support 60 mediation centers. We don't just deal with these religious leaders. We support 60 mediation centers around the country, including in the mixed cities in the Arab sector. And one of the things that I'm doing is very, very quietly is helping religious leaders that are community leaders take, like I have 3 sheikhs in one city. They each pick 5 young 25 to 30-year-olds that they're close with. We're training them in conflict resolution and nonviolence, giving them the religious backing. So therefore, I'm strengthening the religious leader to the younger, and the 25 to 30-year-olds are then going out into the streets and working to mediate between the 18 to 22-year-olds shooting at each other. That is not going to solve all the problems. But one of the things that I need to do is ensure that the 50, 60-year-olds have the 25 to 30-year-olds influencing the 18 to 22-year-olds in terms of what they're seeing on TikTok as well. But we work very, you know, I think about that one moment in May where one of the sheikhs I worked with called 70 18 to 22-year-olds into his mosque and told them all to open up their phones and show him what they're seeing. Let's do a critical viewing of your Instagram. Because it was radicalizing their minds. They didn't have any way of seeing what's real, what's not real. There was a lot of fake news inciting. So yes, religious leaders are being threatened by the phone. Parents are being threatened by the phone. Teachers are being threatened. It's a great potential, and a great potential for, you know, for good and for bad. But if anybody that can stand up against crime families, which we are now being plagued by, it is religious leaders. How that plays out in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we'll have to see.
All right, I think we have time here for just a couple more comments. Justin, source.
All right, did I unmute? I was trying.
Yeah, though we can't see you, Justin.
Okay, yeah, I'm not camera ready this morning. I apologize. But Rabbi Roth, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Now, I was wondering you mentioned the Abraham Accords. and it sounds like you were not, or you didn't like maybe the financial kind of approach to it, maybe. And I'm curious, in any event, do you think it is somehow a leverage towards peace in the region, including Israel-Palestine? Because I read an article this morning on The Economist about how Arab countries are accepting Jews in more and more. And they talked about a Yemeni man who was taken out of Yemen, and he had the choice to go to the Emirates or to go to Israel. And he went to the Emirates because the Emirates offered him a real incentive to go there, and because they're trying to get Jews to move there. So I thought that was like inspiring. And I was curious if you think ultimately, if you think it's a step forward, even for Israel and Palestine.
So here I'm going to pause because I don't want my answer to be recorded.
Question. I mean, given what you're saying about the need for not public behind the scenes negotiations, sometimes with more extreme figures in the conversation, one does wonder, so is all of the, like, is everything that Biden does useless? Like, what do Western leaders who are so prominent in their kind of like in their quote unquote peacemaking, but through your kind of analysis here, we might see as less ultimately significant, what role would you encourage them? What role do they have to play?
It's really always an interesting question of when do insider mediators want to work with outside mediators and vice versa. There have been moments of success and there have been moments where that was a mistake. That's true in general in the theory of change, and that's true in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. Clearly, they play a very important role. The U.S. plays a very important role as an ally of Israel. It's if you noticed when I showed the different the different flags, I intentionally put the American flag close to Israel because everybody's got to be holding hands with somebody else in order to help them make the move. I'm not saying that they don't play a role. They have to play that role. I am saying that them alone, it's not going to be significant enough. They have to also, to what extent, if there was a, like right now, if there could be a 40-year ceasefire, call it peace, call it a hudna, 40 years, no shooting, so that one generation grows up with no violence, with no trauma. The US, I don't think that they are going to be able to play a role in that so much. The Egyptians play a role in that. The Qataris play a role in that. The problem with the Qataris and the Egyptians is that they often have an interest of keeping the conflict on a low flame because that's when Biden will call them, when they're perceived as the mediators. The EU is not considered to be, they're considered to be biased towards the Palestinians. We once had a, where's that recording? Oh, here.
Okay, I want to. I think it'd be wise to end at 11:30, just to like keep to the block here. So I want to give you a chance if you have any kind of final thoughts or words for us. I'm conscious of the fact that we just processed a question about what political leaders in the West doing. There's an even more daring question, which in fact, I think you're going to be answering next time, which is, well, what about us? Right. What might we do, and how might we be involved in the kind of work that seems at this moment so remote from us? So there's a kind of a transition there that I want to suggest, and just to let everybody know that our last session will be on February 27th. So I hope you all join us for that. And Rabbi Roth, anything in closing?
Yeah, no, I just want to say that I hope you'll join us in that last session. It's going to be more using a little bit of a textual exercise that I find to be very, very helpful in training and in my own work in being able to hold up these very conflicting narratives. And ultimately, I think that people could walk away from this session feeling like, okay, this is the work of 8 different people or 5 different people. What I want people to walk away from this series is that each of you are actually can be insider mediators. I mean, everybody's got connections with somebody or could be connected with different people. And when you're thinking about creating networks and you're thinking about creating that peace is not just about a piece of paper, it's about how many different how many different connections could be made between the different parties that are in conflict, and the role that each of you can play as being insiders within your own community, within your larger community. That's what we're really going to explore next time, and hopefully give a little bit of a skill building that you can kind of almost more of a workshop, less frontal, to be able to do that in next session. So I hope you join me.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much to Rabbi Roth. Rabbi Roth, you're I would say, like, I think you'll understand, you're like unexpectedly inspiring, meaning, like, you know, you think of it as inspiring as like, yay, it's all gonna be peace, we just have to love each other, but like, you're inspiring because you're dealing with like the really hard issues and taking such a realist approach, and that actually gives me some hope. So I really appreciate that, and looking forward to learning with you for one more session. I hope you all join us on the 27th. Thanks everyone for being here, and have a good rest of your week. Shavua Tov.